Flight 847 was descending through storm clouds over Denver International Airport when Captain Marcus Sullivan's hands began to shake. The veteran pilot with 23 years of commercial aviation experience gripped the controls tighter, trying to steady himself as lightning illuminated the cockpit in violent flashes. What happened next would transform an ordinary Tuesday evening flight into a moment that would be talked about in aviation circles for years to come. And it all started with a quiet woman in seat 14C who had been reading a book about gardening for the entire 3-hour journey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Captain Marcus Sullivan arrived at the crew briefing room at 6:30 a.m. sharp, his navy blue uniform pressed to perfection, his silver hair combed back in the same style he'd worn since his military days. At 51, Marcus carried himself with the confidence of a man who had logged over 15,000 flight hours without a single incident. His colleagues respected him not just for his technical skills, but for his calm demeanor under pressure, a quality that had earned him the nickname Steady Sullivan among the flight crews. First Officer Jennifer Hayes was already reviewing the weather reports when Marcus entered the briefing room. At 34, Jennifer was one of the airline's rising stars, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to spot potential problems before they became critical. She had been flying with Marcus for the past 8 months, and their partnership had become seamless. He provided the experience. She brought fresh perspectives and modern training techniques. "Morning, Captain," Jennifer said, looking up from her tablet. "We've got some interesting weather patterns forming over Colorado. Nothing too concerning yet, but the meteorology team is tracking a system that might affect our approach into Denver." Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee and settled into his chair. "What kind of system are we talking about?" "Thunderstorms, possibly severe. The forecast shows them developing around 4 p.m. local time, which puts us right in the window. Current prediction has them moving northeast, but you know how these mountain systems can be unpredictable." The flight they were assigned to, Flight 847 from Phoenix to Denver, was a routine run they had flown together dozens of times. The Boeing 737-800 was scheduled to depart at 1:45 p.m., arriving in Denver at 4:20 p.m. Mountain Time. It was a full flight, 162 passengers plus crew, mostly business travelers and families heading home after long weekends in Arizona. As they reviewed the flight plan, neither Marcus nor Jennifer could have imagined that among those 162 passengers sat someone whose quiet presence would soon become the most important factor in all their lives. Sarah Mitchell had boarded the plane with a small carry-on bag, a paperback book about organic gardening, and a secret that she had kept buried for the past 12 years. Sarah took her assigned seat in 14C, a middle seat that she had specifically requested despite the availability of aisle and window options. At 42, she had learned to prefer being surrounded by strangers rather than having too much visibility. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a plain gray sweater that seemed designed to help her blend into the background. To her fellow passengers, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a freelance graphic designer from Scottsdale returning home to visit her elderly mother in Colorado Springs. The truth was far more complex. Sarah Mitchell was formerly Major Sarah Chun Mitchell, United States Army, helicopter pilot with over 1,200 combat hours, flying AH-64 Apache attack helicopters in Afghanistan and Iraq. She had commanded flights through hostile territory, executed precision strikes under enemy fire, and brought her crew home safely through conditions that would have broken lesser pilots. But that was before the incident in Kandahar province, before the investigation, before the quiet resignation that officially ended her military career but left her with skills that civilian life had no use for. She had spent the last 12 years deliberately living small. Freelance design work that could be done from anywhere. Relationships kept casual and temporary. No commitments that would require her to reveal too much about her past. The Army had trained her to compartmentalize, and she had become an expert at keeping her two lives completely separate. The woman who once flew million-dollar killing machines through Taliban-controlled valleys now spent her days designing brochures for local businesses and tending to a small garden behind her rented duplex. As Flight 847 pushed back from the gate at exactly 1:45 p.m., Sarah was already absorbed in her book, The Mindful Gardener, Finding Peace Through Plants. She had chosen the book deliberately. Gardening represented everything her old life wasn't. It was patient, nurturing, focused on growth rather than destruction. The other passengers probably saw her as someone whose biggest worry was whether to plant tomatoes or peppers next season. In the cockpit, Marcus and Jennifer were running through their standard departure procedures. The takeoff was smooth, and they climbed to their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet without incident. The flight attendants, Rachel Torres, David Kim, and Susan Walsh, began their service routine, moving through the cabin with drinks and snacks. It was the kind of unremarkable flight that commercial aviation thrives on. Passengers settling in for a few hours of travel, crew members executing well-rehearsed procedures, everyone assuming they would land safely in Denver and continue with their lives. But Marcus Sullivan was beginning to feel something that concerned him. It started as a slight dizziness during the initial climb, something he attributed to the early morning start and too much coffee. By the time they reached cruising altitude, however, the sensation had evolved into something more troubling. His vision would occasionally blur for a few seconds, and he found himself having to concentrate harder than usual on routine tasks. "Everything okay, Captain?" Jennifer asked, noticing that Marcus had been unusually quiet during the past hour. "Fine," Marcus replied automatically, then caught himself. In all his years of flying, he had never been the type to ignore potential problems or let pride override safety. "Actually, I'm feeling a bit off today. Nothing dramatic, just not quite myself." Jennifer nodded. "Want me to take the controls for a while? You could rest up before we start the descent." "Good idea." Marcus transferred control to Jennifer and leaned back in his seat, hoping that a few minutes of rest would clear his head. He closed his eyes and tried to identify what exactly was wrong. The dizziness was still there, accompanied by what felt like a slight shortness of breath. His left arm had a strange tingling sensation that came and went. Meanwhile, 3 rows behind the wing, Sarah Mitchell had finished 2 chapters of her gardening book and was observing the passengers around her with the unconscious situational awareness that had been drilled into her during her military training. The businessman in 14A was working on his laptop, occasionally glancing at his watch as if worried about a meeting. The college student in 14B was asleep, her head resting against the window. Across the aisle, a family with 2 young children was struggling to keep them entertained. Sarah's trained eye automatically cataloged details that most passengers would never notice. The slight turbulence pattern suggested they were approaching a weather system. The flight attendants were checking their watches more frequently than usual and conferring quietly near the galley. The captain hadn't made any announcements since takeoff, which was slightly unusual for this route. None of these observations triggered any alarm. They were simply the mental habits of someone who had been trained to constantly assess her environment for potential threats or changes. At 3:47 p.m., approximately 40 minutes before their scheduled arrival in Denver, Captain Marcus Sullivan's world began to collapse in ways that no amount of training or experience could have prepared him for. The tingling in his left arm suddenly intensified into a sharp, crushing pain that radiated across his chest. His vision blurred severely, and he felt as if someone had placed an enormous weight on his torso. "Jennifer," he managed to say, his voice strained. "I think I'm having a heart attack." First Officer Hayes immediately took full control of the aircraft and began running through emergency protocols that she had practiced hundreds of times in simulators, but never hoped to use in real life. Denver approach, Flight 847 declaring, "A medical emergency. Captain is incapacitated, requesting priority handling and immediate descent clearance." The response from air traffic control was swift and professional. "Flight 847, understand medical emergency, Captain incapacitated. Descend and maintain 15,000 feet. Vectors for approach runway 34L emergency equipment is being notified." As Jennifer worked through the emergency checklist, Marcus's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. The chest pain was excruciating, and he was struggling to remain conscious. His training told him that he needed to help Jennifer however he could, but his body was betraying him with each passing second. "Rachel!" Jennifer called to the lead flight attendant over the intercom. "I need medical assistance in the cockpit. Immediately. Captain Sullivan is having a medical emergency." Rachel Torres had been a flight attendant for 15 years and had dealt with passenger medical emergencies before, but never with a crew member. She quickly asked if there were any doctors or medical personnel on board, and was relieved when Dr. Patricia Reeves, a cardiologist from Phoenix, immediately volunteered to help. Dr. Reeves examined Marcus quickly but thoroughly. "This appears to be a major cardiac event," she told Jennifer quietly. "He's stable for now, but he needs immediate medical attention. The good news is that he's conscious and his vital signs, while concerning, aren't critical yet." Jennifer nodded grimly. She had trained for this scenario, but the reality was far more intense than any simulator could replicate. She was now solely responsible for safely landing 162 passengers and crew members in increasingly challenging weather conditions. With storm clouds building around Denver International Airport, the approach into Denver was going to be complicated under the best of circumstances. The weather system that had been developing all day was now directly over the airport, with reports of severe turbulence, wind shear, and heavy precipitation. Under normal conditions, Marcus's experience with mountain weather would have been invaluable. Now Jennifer was facing the most challenging landing of her career, with no backup. As Flight 847 descended through 20,000 feet, the aircraft began encountering the edge of the storm system. Light turbulence became moderate, then severe. Lightning flashed continuously outside the cockpit windows, and the radar screen showed solid bands of precipitation across their approach path. Denver approach, Flight 847, were encountering severe turbulence and need vectors around the heaviest precipitation, Jennifer radioed, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Flight 847, turn right heading 090, descend to 12,000 feet. Be advised that conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Current winds at the surface are 280 at 25 knots, gusting to 40. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The turbulence was becoming so severe that passengers were gripping their armrests and several were becoming airsick. The flight attendants had long since secured the cabin and taken their seats, following emergency protocols. In seat 14C, Sarah Mitchell had closed her gardening book and was watching the cockpit area with growing concern. Her military experience told her that something was seriously wrong beyond just the rough weather. The flight attendant's body language suggested a major problem, and she had noticed Dr. Reeves moving toward the front of the aircraft with obvious urgency. When the cockpit door remained open longer than usual and she caught a glimpse of only one pilot at the controls, her suspicions were confirmed. Sarah had deliberately left her military life behind, but the current situation was triggering instincts and training that had been dormant for 12 years. She found herself mentally reviewing emergency procedures, calculating approach angles based on the aircraft's current attitude and behavior, and assessing the capabilities of what appeared to be a single pilot trying to handle an emergency landing. In severe weather at 11,000 feet, Jennifer was fighting to maintain control of the aircraft as it was buffeted by winds that seemed to be coming from every direction simultaneously. The approach path to runway 34L required precise navigation through a corridor between mountain peaks, and the storm was making it nearly impossible to maintain the required heading and descent rate. Flight 847, how are you handling the approach? Denver approach inquired. Jennifer's response revealed the strain she was under. We're managing, but barely. The turbulence is severe, and I'm having difficulty maintaining the localizer course. What she didn't say over the radio was that she was beginning to doubt her ability to execute a safe landing under these conditions. The combination of severe weather, emergency pressure, and the knowledge that 162 lives depended entirely on her decisions was creating a level of stress that threatened to overwhelm even her excellent training. In the passenger cabin, Sarah Mitchell was watching the situation develop with the analytical mind of someone who had faced life or death decisions in combat. She could see that the single pilot was struggling with the approach, and her military experience told her that the current conditions were at the absolute edge of what even an experienced crew could handle safely. For 12 years, Sarah had maintained her anonymity, living quietly and avoiding any situation that might require her to reveal her military background. She had successfully hidden her past from employers, neighbors, friends, and even the few romantic relationships she had allowed herself. The woman who had once been trusted with million-dollar aircraft and life-or-death missions had become someone whose most significant responsibility was meeting design deadlines for small business clients. But as Flight 847 continued its turbulent descent toward Denver International Airport, Sarah Mitchell realized that her long exile from the world of aviation might be about to end. The quiet woman in Seat 14C, who had spent years cultivating an image of gentle domesticity, was about to face a choice that would either maintain her carefully constructed new identity or reveal the warrior she had once been. At 8,000 feet, with the runway lights of Denver International Airport barely visible through the storm, and First Officer Jennifer Hayes fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that seemed determined to tear itself apart in the violent winds, the moment of decision was rapidly approaching. At 7,500 feet, the Boeing 737 shuddered violently as it encountered a downdraft that sent several passengers' stomachs into their throats. Jennifer Hayes felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool cockpit temperature as she fought to regain the lost altitude. Behind her, Captain Sullivan was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored while Dr. Reeves monitored his vital signs with growing concern. Flight 847, Denver approach. We're showing you 200 feet below your assigned altitude. Please confirm your status. Jennifer keyed the microphone with one hand while wrestling the yoke with the other. Denver approach, experiencing severe downdrafts, climbing back to assigned altitude now. But even as she said it, another powerful gust knocked the aircraft sideways, causing several overhead bins to pop open and sending loose items tumbling down the aisle. The passengers were becoming increasingly frightened. What had started as typical turbulence was now clearly something more serious. Children were crying, adults were gripping their armrests with white knuckles, and the elderly woman in Seat 12A was quietly praying in Spanish. The cabin lights flickered intermittently as the aircraft's electrical systems struggled with the atmospheric interference from the lightning strikes surrounding them. Sarah Mitchell remained outwardly calm, but internally she was conducting a tactical assessment that would have been familiar to her Apache squadron mates from Kandahar. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly with crosswinds exceeding safe landing parameters. Aircraft status structurally sound but operating at the POV limits of its performance envelope. Crew capability, single pilot under extreme stress, medical emergency in progress, passenger anxiety approaching panic levels. In her military days, this kind of analysis would have been followed immediately by action. She would have taken control, made split-second decisions, and used every ounce of her training to bring everyone home safely. But that was before everything changed, before the inquiry, before she had learned that sometimes the cost of being right was higher than the cost of staying silent. Incident that ended her military career had started much like this: a crisis situation where her skills and judgment were desperately needed. She had been the most experienced pilot in her unit, the one others turned to when missions went sideways. On that day in Afghanistan, when her wingman's Apache had been hit by ground fire and was going down in hostile territory, she had made a decision that saved 4 lives but violated direct orders from command. The court-martial had been a formality. Technically, she had disobeyed a direct order. Practically, she had prevented the deaths of 4 soldiers who were now home with their families instead of buried in Arlington Cemetery. The Army had given her a choice: accept a reprimand and continue her career with a permanent black mark, or resign quietly with full honors and benefits. She had chosen to leave, unable to serve in a system that punished results over process. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Hayes speaking from the cockpit. Jennifer's voice came over the intercom, steady despite the chaos around her. We're experiencing some weather-related turbulence as we make our approach into Denver. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened tightly. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes. What Jennifer didn't announce was that she was beginning to doubt whether she could execute a safe landing. The crosswinds were now gusting to 45 knots, well beyond the aircraft's certified landing limits. The rain was so heavy that visibility was nearly zero, and the runway approach lights were barely visible through the storm. Most concerning of all, she was starting to feel the early signs of spatial disorientation, a dangerous condition where a pilot's inner ear conflicts with visual references, making it nearly impossible to determine the aircraft's actual attitude. At 6,000 feet, disaster struck with shocking suddenness. Captain Sullivan, who had been semi-conscious for the past 20 minutes, suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Dr. Reeves immediately began CPR while calling for the portable defibrillator, but the violent turbulence made effective chest compressions nearly impossible. Jennifer, Dr. Reeves shouted over the engine noise and storm, I need you to level off. I can't work on him with this movement. But leveling off wasn't an option. They were locked into the approach pattern, and any deviation would require requesting vectors that would take them back into the storm for another attempt. With fuel running low and weather conditions deteriorating by the minute, Jennifer knew they had one chance to get this right. The stress was becoming overwhelming. Jennifer had trained for single-pilot operations, but never under these conditions. The aircraft was bucking like an angry horse. Her instruments were fluctuating wildly due to electrical interference, and now she could hear the sounds of medical emergency procedures being performed directly behind her. Her hands were shaking, and she was beginning to hyperventilat. 4,500 feet. Jennifer made a critical error. Overwhelmed by the multiple emergencies and fighting severe spatial disorientation, she overcompensated for a wind gust and put the aircraft into a steep bank that exceeded safe parameters. The Boeing 737 rolled nearly 40 degrees to the left before she could correct, causing several passengers to scream and sending unsecured items flying across the cabin. Flight 847, Denver approach. We show you an unusual attitude. Are you experiencing difficulty? Jennifer's response was delayed and strained. Denver approach, we're having some control issues. Requesting immediate vectors to final approach. Flight 847, turn left heading 270. Descend to 3,000 feet. You're cleared for the ILS approach to runway 34L. Emergency equipment is standing by. Sarah Mitchell watched this exchange with growing alarm. Her trained ear could detect the stress and uncertainty in the pilot's voice, and her eyes could see the aircraft's erratic behavior through the small cabin windows. The wings were rocking back and forth in a pattern that suggested the pilot was overcorrecting for the wind conditions, a classic sign of someone who was reaching the limits of their capability. She closed her gardening book and placed it carefully in the seat pocket in front of her. For the first time in 12 years, Major Sarah Chen Mitchell began to consider coming out of retirement. The decision wasn't easy. Revealing her identity would mean answering questions she had spent years avoiding. Her fellow passengers would want to know why she had hidden her background, what she had done in the military, why she had left. The media attention afterward would be inevitable, and with it would come the scrutiny of her military record, the incident in Afghanistan, and all the reasons she had chosen to disappear into civilian anonymity. But as the aircraft continued its unstable descent, and she listened to Dr. Reeves working frantically to save Captain Sullivan's life, Sarah realized that her personal comfort was less important than the lives of 162 people who were depending on anyone to get them safely to the ground. At 3,200 feet, Jennifer Hayes made a decision that demonstrated both her professionalism and her growing desperation. She activated the aircraft's autopilot and tried to let the computer handle the approach while she gathered herself. For a few moments it seemed to work. The aircraft steadied slightly, and she was able to take several deep breaths and clear her head, but the autopilot wasn't designed to handle conditions this severe. Within 30 seconds, it began to oscillate wildly as it tried to compensate for the conflicting wind patterns. The aircraft rolled left, then right, then left again in increasingly violent motions that had passengers screaming and flight attendants struggling to remain in their seats. Autopilot disconnect, Jennifer announced, taking manual control again. But the brief respite had been insufficient to restore her confidence or clear her disorientation. If anything, the autopilot's failure had made her more aware of how close they were to losing control completely. At 2,800 feet, with the runway approach lights finally visible through the storm, Sarah Mitchell unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The action was so unexpected in the middle of severe turbulence that several passengers turned to stare at her. Flight attendant Rachel Torres immediately called out, "Ma'am, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened." Sarah ignored her and began moving toward the front of the aircraft, using the seatbacks to steady herself against the violent motion. Her movements were confident and purposeful, those of someone who had navigated much worse conditions in military aircraft that had been shot full of holes and were missing various pieces of their control surfaces. "Ma'am, I'm serious," Rachel called again, unbuckling her own seatbelt to intercept her. "You cannot be up during landing." Sarah reached the galley area where Rachel was struggling to reach her and looked the flight attendant directly in the eyes. "I need to get to the cockpit," she said quietly but firmly. "Your pilot is in trouble, and I can help. I don't care what you think you can do," Rachel replied, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Passengers are not allowed in the cockpit during emergencies. Please return to your seat immediately." It was then that Sarah Mitchell spoke the words that would change everything. "My name is Major Sarah Chen Mitchell, United States Army, retired. I have over 1,200 hours of helicopter flight time in combat conditions, including emergency landings in weather worse than this. That pilot up there is running out of options, and I'm probably the only person on this aircraft who can help her." Rachel stared at her for a moment, processing this information while the aircraft continued to buck and roll around them. The sound of Dr. Reeves working on Captain Sullivan was clearly audible from the cockpit, and Jennifer's increasingly stressed radio communications suggested that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Can you prove that?" Rachel asked. Sarah reached into her wallet and produced a card that she hadn't looked at in years, her retired military ID. Rachel examined it quickly, noting the photograph that matched the woman in front of her and the designation that confirmed she had indeed been a helicopter pilot. "Jesus," Rachel whispered. "Are you serious about being able to help?" "Dead serious," Sarah replied. "But we need to move fast. From what I can hear, your first officer is dealing with spatial disorientation, and in these conditions, that's going to end badly for everyone." Rachel made a decision that went against every protocol in her training manual. "Follow me," she said, and led Sarah toward the cockpit door. At 2,400 feet, with the runway threshold barely visible through sheets of rain and the aircraft wallowing through wind shear that was testing the limits of its structural integrity, Jennifer Hayes was beginning to accept that she might not be able to save everyone on board. Her instruments were showing conflicting information. Her inner ear was telling her they were in a climbing right turn when her eyes said they were descending straight ahead, and the controls felt increasingly unresponsive. Behind her, Dr. Reeves had managed to restart Captain Sullivan's heart, but he remained unconscious and his condition was still critical. The portable defibrillator had been used twice, and his pulse was weak and irregular. Even if they managed to land safely, he would need immediate advanced medical care to survive. It was at this moment of maximum crisis that Rachel Torres knocked on the cockpit door and called out the words that would either save Flight 847 or add another tragedy to aviation history. "Jennifer, I have someone here who says she can help fly this plane." Jennifer's first instinct was to refuse. She had been trained never to allow unauthorized personnel in the cockpit, especially during emergencies. But as another violent gust of wind threatened to roll the aircraft beyond recovery limits, she realized that her pride and adherence to protocol might be less important than accepting help from any qualified source. "Who is it?" she called back, still fighting the controls. "She says she's a retired Army helicopter pilot with combat experience." At 2,100 feet, with less than 3 minutes until they would either touch down safely or become a statistic, first Officer Jennifer Hayes made the most important decision of her career. "Send her in," she said, and prepared to meet the quiet woman from seat 14C, who was about to reveal that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are hiding in plain sight. The cockpit door opened to reveal a woman who looked nothing like what Jennifer Hayes had expected. Sarah Mitchell appeared ordinary, almost unremarkable, someone you might pass in a grocery store without a second glance. But as she stepped into the cockpit and immediately assessed the instrument panel with sharp, analytical eyes, something fundamental shifted in the cramped space, where life and death decisions were being made at 2,000 feet above ground. "What's your situation?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the chaos with military precision. She had already noted Jennifer's white-knuckled grip on the yoke, the sweat on her brow, and the slight tremor in her hands that indicated someone fighting both the aircraft and her own nervous system. "Severe crosswinds, gusting to 45 knots," Jennifer replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. "Visibility near zero, and I'm getting conflicting readings from my attitude indicator. I think I'm dealing with some spatial disorientation." Sarah moved to jump seat behind the center console, buckling herself in with efficient movements. "What's your ground speed?" 140 over the ground, but the wind is pushing us all over the localizer. "Flap setting?" "Full flaps, landing configuration." Sarah studied the primary flight display for 10 seconds, her combat-trained mind processing information at a speed that civilian flying rarely demanded. She could see that Jennifer was fighting the aircraft rather than working with it, making small corrections that were being amplified by the severe wind conditions into larger oscillations. "Jennifer," Sarah said calmly, "you're over-controlling. The aircraft wants to fly, but you're fighting it every inch of the way." "Easy for you to say," Jennifer snapped, stress making her defensive. You're not the one trying to land this thing. You're right, I'm not, Sarah acknowledged. But I've landed aircraft in sandstorms where I couldn't see my own rotor blades, and the principle is the same. Stop trying to force the aircraft to do what you want. Instead, anticipate what it's going to do and stay ahead of it. At 1,800 feet, the aircraft hit another severe downdraft that dropped them 200 feet in less than 3 seconds. Jennifer pulled back hard on the yoke, but the correction came too late and too strong, causing the aircraft to balloon upward and fall behind the proper approach path. Flight 847, Denver approach. You're showing high on the glide slope. Recommend going around for another approach. Jennifer's hand moved toward the radio, but Sarah reached out and stopped her. Don't, she said firmly. Look at your fuel state. Jennifer glanced at the fuel gauges and felt her heart sink. They had enough fuel for maybe one more approach, and that was assuming they could get vectors quickly and didn't have to hold in. The storm, we can't go around, she admitted. Then we make this one work, Sarah said. But you're going to have to trust me. Reduce power and let the aircraft settle back onto the glide slope naturally. Don't force it. That's going to put us into the downdraft again. Yes, it is. And when it does, we'll ride it down and use the energy from the updraft on the other side to get back on path. It's like flying through a mountain wave, except horizontally. Jennifer had never heard of such a technique, but something in Sarah's voice, a calm confidence, born of experience in far worse conditions, made her hesitate instead of dismissing the advice outright. Behind them, Dr. Reeves was still working. On Captain Sullivan, who had stabilized somewhat but remained unconscious. How much longer until we're on the ground? She called out. 3 minutes, Jennifer replied, then followed Sarah's advice and reduced power. The aircraft immediately began to sink, and every instinct she had screamed at her to add power and climb. Instead, she forced herself to wait. The downdraft hit them like a giant fist, dropping the Boeing 737 nearly 300 feet in 5 seconds. Passengers screamed, overhead bins rattled, and Jennifer's hands moved instinctively toward the power levers. But Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. Wait for it. Wait for it. Now add power, gentle pressure, don't jam it. The updraft came exactly as Sarah had predicted, lifting the aircraft back toward the glide slope with surprising smoothness. For the first time since the emergency began, Jennifer felt like she was working with the weather instead of against it. How did you know that would work? Jennifer asked, amazement creeping into her voice. Pattern recognition, Sarah replied. Weather is weather, whether you're flying a helicopter through the Hindu Kush or a 737 through a Colorado thunderstorm. The aircraft changes, but the physics stay the same. At 1,400 feet, they broke through the lowest layer of clouds and could suddenly see the runway approach lights, stretching out ahead of them like a string of pearls in the darkness. But their problems were far from over. The crosswind was still, gusting violently, and Sarah could see that Jennifer was tensing up again as she prepared for the most difficult part of any landing, transitioning from instrument flight to visual contact with the runway. Talk me through what you're seeing, Sarah said. Runway's about 15 degrees left of center, and I can see we're being pushed by the crosswind. I need to crab into the wind to maintain centerline. Good. What else? The runway lights are oscillating, which means we're still getting significant wind shear. Excellent. You're reading the conditions correctly. Now what's your plan for the flare and touchdown? Jennifer was quiet for a moment, running through the procedures in her mind. Maintain the crab angle until the flare, then kick out the drift. With rudder and use aileron to keep the wings level. That's textbook technique, and it'll work in normal conditions. But these aren't normal conditions. The wind shear is too severe for a standard approach. You need to fly it all the way to the ground. Fly it to the ground? That's not how we're trained to land airliners. It's how you land military transports in combat zones. Sarah said. No flare, no attempt to make it pretty. Just controlled. Flight into the runway surface. The landing gear can handle it, and it's the only way to maintain control in these wind conditions. At 1,200 feet, the aircraft was buffeted by another series of wind gusts that threatened to push them off the localizer. Jennifer started to overcorrect again, but Sarah's voice kept her centered. Small inputs. Let the aircraft do the work. You're just making suggestions, not giving orders. This is insane, Jennifer muttered, but she followed Sarah's guidance and made smaller, more gradual corrections. Insane would be trying to execute a perfect civilian landing in conditions that would challenge a military crew. Sarah replied, What we're doing is adapting to reality instead of sticking to procedures that don't fit the situation. As they descended through 1,000 feet, Sarah began to understand something that had been nagging at her since she entered the cockpit. Jennifer Hayes was an excellent pilot. Her instrument scan was precise. Her knowledge was comprehensive, and her basic flying skills were solid. But she had been trained for normal operations within established parameters. She had never been forced to operate beyond the edge of the envelope, where procedures broke down and survival depended on instinct, experience, and the willingness to improvise. It was exactly the kind of situation that Sarah had faced dozens of times in Afghanistan, where the enemy didn't care about your flight manual and the weather didn't respect your operational limitations. You adapted or you died. Jennifer, Sarah said as they passed through 800 feet, I need to tell you something. You're a better pilot than you think you are. The only reason you're struggling is because you've never been asked to fly beyond the textbook. But the aircraft doesn't know the difference between a combat zone and a civilian airport. It only knows physics. Easy for you to say you've done this before. Yes, I have. And the first time was terrifying. I was 26 years old, flying a medical evacuation mission in Iraq, and we lost hydraulic power during approach to a forward operating base that was under mortar attack. No power steering, manual reversion only, and I had to land on a dirt strip with wounded soldiers in the back who would die if I screwed it up. Jennifer glanced at her briefly. What happened? I stopped trying to fly the aircraft the way I'd been taught and started flying it the way it needed to be flown. Just like you're doing right now. At 600 feet, the runway threshold was clearly visible, but the crosswind was pushing them toward the edge of the pavement. Jennifer applied left rudder to maintain center line, but the aircraft's nose swung too far, and they were suddenly pointing well left of the runway heading. I'm losing it, Jennifer said, panic creeping into her voice. No, you're not, Sarah replied firmly. Right rudder, ease it back to center. The aircraft is just telling you where the wind is coming from. Listen to it. Jennifer made the correction. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Instead of fighting the wind, she began to dance with it, making small adjustments that kept them aligned with the runway centerline, while accommodating the gusting conditions. At 400 feet, Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Jennifer, I want you to let me have the radios. You focus entirely on flying the aircraft. What? No, I can't. Yes, you can. You're doing great. But you're trying to do too many things at once. Let me handle communications while you concentrate on the approach. Jennifer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Sarah took the radio microphone and keyed it. Denver approach. Flight 847 is on final approach, runway in sight. We'll be making a no-flare landing due to wind conditions. Flight 847, understood. Emergency equipment is standing by. Winds are now 290 at 35, gusting to 50. Copy the winds, Sarah replied, then turned to Jennifer. You heard that. The wind is almost a direct crosswind now, which actually makes things easier. Just keep flying toward the runway and let the aircraft settle onto the pavement when it's ready. At 200 feet, they encountered the most severe wind shear of the entire approach. The aircraft dropped like a stone for 3 seconds, then was caught by an updraft that threatened to balloon them back into the sky. Jennifer's training screamed at her to add power and climb, but Sarah's calm voice kept her on track. Write it down. The runway's right there. Don't fight it. At 100 feet, Jennifer could see individual runway lights flashing past the cockpit windows. The crosswind was still pushing them sideways, but instead of fighting it, she had learned to anticipate it and make corrections before they became critical. At 50 feet, Sarah spoke for the last time before touchdown. This is it, Jennifer. You've got this. Just fly it to the ground like we discussed. At 20 feet, Jennifer did something that violated every civilian landing technique she had ever been taught. Instead of flaring the aircraft and trying to make a smooth touchdown, she flew it directly into the runway surface with the precision of a military pilot, making a tactical approach under fire. The main landing gear contacted the wet pavement with a thud that rattled every passenger's teeth, but the aircraft remained firmly planted and tracking straight down the center line. The nose gear came down hard, and Jennifer immediately deployed the thrust reversers while applying maximum braking. Flight 847, welcome to Denver, came the voice from the control tower. Outstanding job under extremely difficult conditions. As the aircraft rolled to a stop on the taxiway, surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights, Jennifer Hayes turned to look at the woman who had appeared from nowhere to help save 162 lives. Sarah Mitchell was already unbuckling her harness, preparing to return to her anonymous existence in seat 14C. Wait, Jennifer said. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved all of us. Sarah paused at the cockpit door. You saved us, she replied quietly. I just reminded you of something you already knew how to do. You're a hell of a pilot, Jennifer Hayes. As Sarah disappeared back into the passenger cabin, Dr. Reeves looked up from where she was still monitoring Captain Sullivan. Is he going to be okay? Jennifer asked. He's stable, and the paramedics are already on board, Dr. Reeves replied. But if we had been up there much longer, or if this landing had gone badly. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Jennifer sat in the captain's seat for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had executed the most difficult landing of her career with the help of a passenger who had materialized from the cabin, like some sort of aviation guardian angel. But as she began to shut down the aircraft systems, she realized that she still knew almost nothing about the woman who had saved them all. In the passenger cabin, Sarah Mitchell had returned to seat 14C and reopened her gardening book. To the other passengers, she appeared to be exactly what she had seen before the crisis, a quiet woman more interested in plants than in the dramatic events that had just unfolded around her. But as the emergency vehicles surrounded Flight 847 and the passengers began to realize how close they had come to disaster, Sarah knew that her 12 years of anonymity were about to end. In the age of cell phones and social media, there was no way to keep her role in the emergency landing secret. By tomorrow, everyone would know that the woman in seat 14C had once been Major Sarah Sheen Mitchell, and the questions she had spent over a decade avoiding would demand answers. For now, though, she was content to sit quietly and read about soil composition and proper watering techniques while the chaos of an emergency landing swirled around her. She had done what needed to be done, and 162 people were alive because of it. Everything else was just details that would have to be dealt with later. Within minutes of Flight 847's emergency landing, Denver International Airport had transformed into a carefully choreographed dance of emergency response teams. Paramedics rushed aboard to attend to Captain Sullivan, while fire trucks positioned themselves around the aircraft as a precautionary measure. The passengers, still shaken from their harrowing experience, were being evacuated through the main cabin door where buses waited to transport them to the terminal. Sarah Mitchell moved with the crowd, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact with the emergency personnel who were documenting the incident. She had managed to slip her military ID back into her wallet before anyone could see it, and she hoped that in the confusion of the evacuation, her role in the emergency landing might go unnoticed. It was a naive hope that would be shattered. Within the hour, flight attendant Rachel Torres was giving her statement to an FAA investigator when she mentioned the passenger who had assisted in the cockpit. She said she was a retired Army helicopter pilot, Rachel explained, Major Sarah Chen Mitchell. She showed me her military ID. The investigator, Janet Morrison, had been looking into aviation incidents for 15 years and had never heard of a passenger intervening in a cockpit emergency. Did you get her contact information? No, sir. Everything happened so fast, and once we landed safely, she just went back to her seat like nothing had happened. Morrison made a note to interview this mysterious passenger as part of the standard investigation protocol. Within 30 minutes, she had Sarah's name from the passenger manifest and was making calls to verify her military background. What she discovered would turn a routine emergency landing investigation into something much more significant. Major Sarah Chen Mitchell's military records were partially classified, but Morrison had the clearance necessary to access the basic details. Combat helicopter pilot, multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, commendations for valor under fire, and an abrupt resignation in 2013 following an incident that was heavily redacted in the files. More importantly for the current situation, she had logged over 1,200 hours of flight time in some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. By the time Sarah reached the terminal, her anonymity was already evaporating. Morrison found her at baggage claim, looking every bit like the unassuming graphic designer she claimed to be, reading her gardening book while waiting for her single carry-on bag. Ms. Mitchell? Morrison approached with her credentials visible. I'm Janet Morrison with the FAA. I'd like to speak with you about what happened on Flight 847. Sarah looked up from her book with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation, but hoping to avoid it. I already gave my statement. To the flight attendant, there's nothing more to add. I think there's quite a bit more to add, Major, Morrison said quietly, using Sarah's former military rank deliberately. Your role in preventing what could have been a catastrophic accident is going to be part of the official record. I can either get your version of events now, or I can piece it together from other sources, your choice. Sarah closed her book and sighed. She had known this moment would come eventually, she just hadn't expected it to happen on a Tuesday evening in Denver, while she was trying to get home from a weekend visit to her mother. What do you want to know? Morrison led her to a quiet corner of the terminal where they could speak privately. Let's start with how a graphic designer from Phoenix happens to know advanced aviation techniques that saved 162 lives. I used to fly helicopters, Sarah said simply. Army, I retired 12 years ago. The records I've seen indicate you didn't retire voluntarily. They suggest you resigned under circumstances related to an incident in Afghanistan. Sarah's jaw tightened. This was exactly the kind of scrutiny she had spent over a decade avoiding. My military service ended in 2013. What I did afterward is my own business. Normally, I'd agree with you, Morrison said. But when a former combat pilot intervenes in a civilian aviation emergency and demonstrates skills that potentially prevented a major disaster, it becomes a matter of public interest. The media is already asking questions. As if summoned by Morrison's words, Sarah noticed a local news crew setting up near the gate where Flight 847's passengers were being interviewed. Several passengers were animatedly describing their experience, and she caught fragments of their conversations. Woman from the back of the plane. Said she was a helicopter pilot. Saved all our lives. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, Sarah muttered. Why? Morrison asked. Most people would consider what you did heroic. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching. The news crew interviewed passengers who were describing her intervention in increasingly dramatic terms. "Because heroes get scrutinized," she finally said. "And I've had enough scrutiny to last several lifetimes." Before Morrison could respond, a commotion near the gate caught their attention. Jennifer Hayes had emerged from the post-incident debriefing and was being approached by reporters who had learned about the unusual circumstances of the emergency landing. Sarah watched as the young first officer handled the questions with professional composure, deflecting most inquiries while acknowledging that she had received assistance from an experienced passenger. "She's protecting you," Morrison observed. "But that won't last long. Someone filmed the evacuation on their phone, and there's already footage circulating on social media showing you entering the cockpit during the emergency." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The digital age had made true anonymity nearly impossible, and she realized that her carefully constructed post-military life was about to be exposed to exactly the kind of public attention she had spent years avoiding. Within hours, the story had exploded across aviation news sites and social media platforms. "Mystery passenger saves commercial flight," read the headline on Aviation Weekly's website. The Denver Post had picked up the story with the angle former military pilot emerges from anonymity to prevent air disaster. By evening, it had reached the national news networks. Sarah's phone began ringing incessantly with calls from reporters, military journalists, and documentary producers. She turned it off and drove to her small duplex in Scottsdale, hoping to wait out the media attention in the quiet sanctuary she had created for herself. But as she pulled into her driveway, she discovered that sanctuary no longer existed. 3 news vans were parked on her street, and reporters were stationed outside her front door. Neighbors she barely knew were being interviewed about the mysterious woman who lived quietly among them. Mrs. Henderson from next door was telling a CNN correspondent about Sarah's beautiful garden and how she never would have guessed she was some sort of war hero. Sarah parked a block away and called her landlord. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask a favor. Can I use the back entrance to your property management office? I need somewhere to lay low for a few hours." Patterson, who had been receiving calls from reporters all afternoon, was sympathetic. "Sarah, what the hell is going on? I've got news people asking me about your lease agreement and wanting to know if you ever mentioned being in the military." "It's complicated," Sarah said. "I helped out with an emergency on a flight today, and now everyone wants to make it into a bigger story than it needs to be." "You mean that thing about the passenger who saved the plane? That was you?" "Like I said, it's complicated." Patterson let her into his office through the rear entrance and provided her with coffee and a quiet place to think. But thinking was the last thing Sarah wanted to do. For 12 years, she had successfully avoided confronting her past, her reasons for leaving the military, and the incident that had cost her a career she loved. Now all of it was about to be dragged into public view. Her phone, which she had reluctantly turned back on, showed dozens of missed calls and text messages. Most were from reporters, but several were from people she hadn't heard from in years. Former squadron mates who had seen the news coverage and recognized her name. Military friends who were wondering why she had never told them she was living in Phoenix. And one message that made her hands shake as she read it. "Sarah, it's Colonel Bradley Wright, your former commanding officer. I saw the news about Flight 847. We need to talk. Please call me when you get this." Colonel Wright had been the investigating officer in the incident that ended her military career. He was also the man who had given her the choice between a court-martial and a quiet resignation. Sarah hadn't spoken to him since the day she signed her discharge papers, and she had no desire to speak to him now. But as the evening wore on and the media attention continued to intensify, Sarah began to realize that hiding was no longer an option. The story was already public. and her role in preventing a potential disaster had captured the public imagination in ways that guaranteed continued scrutiny. She could either control the narrative by telling her own story, or she could let others tell it for her. At 9 p.m., her phone rang with a call from an unlisted number. Against her better judgment, she answered it. "Major Mitchell, this is Tom Williams from 60 Minutes. I know you're probably being inundated with media requests, but I'd like to offer you something different. Instead of a quick news hit or sensationalized coverage, we'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your story properly. All of it, including why you left the military and why you've been living under the radar for 12 years. Sarah's first instinct was to hang up. National television exposure was the last thing she wanted. But Williams continued before she could respond. "I've done some preliminary research on your military record," he said. "I know about the incident in Kandahar province, and I know it ended your career. But I also know that 4 soldiers are alive today because of what you did. Maybe it's time people heard the whole story instead of just the parts that fit someone else's narrative." "Why would you want to do that?" Sarah asked. "Because the public has a right to know who their heroes really are," Williams replied. "And because hiding from your past hasn't made it go away. It's just postponed to the day when you'd have to deal with it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue to run, find another city where she could disappear again and hope that the media attention would eventually fade. Or she could finally confront the demons she had been avoiding for over a decade. "If I were to consider this," she said carefully, "I'd want editorial control over how the military incident is presented. And I'd want guarantees that my current neighbors and friends won't be harassed by your production team." "Those terms are reasonable," Williams said. "But I should warn you, once this story airs, there's no going back to anonymity. Your life as Sarah Mitchell, graphic designer, will be over." "It's already over," Sarah said, looking out the window at the news vans that were still parked on her street. "The question is whether I let other people define who I am, or whether I finally tell the truth myself." That night, alone in her landlord's office while reporters camped outside her home, Sarah Mitchell made the decision that would change everything. She would tell her story, all of it, including the parts she had spent 12 years trying to forget. She would explain why she had left the military, why she had hidden her identity, and how a quiet Tuesday evening flight had forced her to confront a past she could no longer escape. But first, she had one phone call to make. She dialed the number that Colonel Wright had left in his message, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would determine whether her story would be one of redemption or further disgrace. The phone rang 3 times. Before Wright answered. "Sarah," he said simply, "I was wondering when you'd call." "Colonel," she replied, using his rank out of habit, "I think it's time we finished the conversation we started 12 years ago." "Colonel Wright," Sarah said into the phone, her voice steady despite the emotional storm brewing inside her. "I assume you've seen the news coverage." "I have," Wright replied, his tone measured and professional. "Congratulations on preventing what could have been a major tragedy. Your skills haven't diminished since you left the service." Sarah waited for him to continue, knowing that congratulations weren't the reason for his call. Colonel Bradley Wright had never been one for small talk, and the incident that had ended her career remained unfinished business between them. "Sarah, we need to discuss Kandahar. The media is going to dig into your military record, and when they do, they're going to find questions that were never fully answered. Questions that could overshadow what you accomplished today." The mention of Kandahar sent Sarah's mind racing back to a dusty forward operating base in Afghanistan, where a routine mission had become a nightmare that haunted her dreams for years. She had successfully avoided thinking about that day for months at a time, but now it was about to be thrust back into public view. "What exactly are you suggesting, Colonel?" "I'm suggesting that you and I have a conversation that should have happened 12 years ago." One where you tell me exactly what happened that day, without the politics and career considerations that complicated things back then. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the impossible choice she had faced in the skies. Above Afghanistan, her wingman's Apache had been hit by enemy fire and was going down in hostile territory. Command had ordered her to maintain position and wait for ground support, but she knew that the crew would be dead before help arrived. So she had disobeyed direct orders and executed a combat rescue that saved 4 lives but ended her military career. I told you what happened in my official statement, Sarah said. You told me the minimum required to close the investigation, Wright corrected. But you never explained why a decorated pilot with a spotless record would suddenly ignore direct orders from command. There was more to that story, and we both know it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of news crews outside the building where she was hiding. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 12 years running from her past, only to have a moment of heroism drag it all back into the light. If I tell you the truth about Kandahar, she said finally, what happens to that information? That depends on what the truth is, Wright replied. But I can tell you this, the media is going to investigate, whether you want them to or not. You can either control that narrative by being honest about what happened, or you can let them piece together their own version from incomplete records and speculation. The decision Sarah faced was no longer about protecting her privacy. That battle had been lost the moment she stepped into the cockpit of Flight 847. Now the question was whether she would tell her story on her own terms, or let others define her legacy based on fragments and assumptions. Colonel, what I'm about to tell you goes beyond what was in any official report, Sarah began. The day my wingman's helicopter was hit, I wasn't just disobeying orders to attempt a rescue. I was preventing a cover-up that would have cost 4 soldiers their lives to protect someone's political career. Wright was silent, waiting for her to continue. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan was the mission commander that day, Sarah continued, referring to an officer who had later risen to become a general. He had made a tactical error that put my wingman's aircraft in the line of fire, and when they went down, his first concern wasn't rescuing the crew, it was covering his mistake. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah remembered the radio chatter, the desperate calls for help from the downed crew, and Brennan's orders to maintain position while he figured out how to spin the incident to minimize his responsibility. Brennan ordered you not to attempt the rescue? Wright asked. He ordered me to wait for ground support that we both knew wouldn't arrive in time. He was willing to let 4 soldiers die rather than admit he had made an error in judgment that put them in danger, and you chose to ignore those orders. I chose to save 4 lives, Sarah said firmly. The rescue was successful, but Brennan needed someone to blame for the entire incident. He couldn't court-martial me without exposing his own mistakes, so he offered me the choice between a quiet resignation and a public investigation that would have destroyed both our careers. Wright absorbed this information, understanding for the first time the full context of Sarah's abrupt departure from the military. Why didn't you tell me this during the investigation? Because I was tired, Sarah admitted. Tired of fighting. Tired of politics. Tired of a system that prioritized careers over lives. I just wanted out. Sarah, you know that Brennan is now General Brennan, Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had deliberately avoided following the careers of her former colleagues, but learning that the man who had been willing to sacrifice 4 soldiers to protect his reputation had risen to one of the highest positions in the Army was nauseating. That's exactly why I've stayed hidden for 12 years, she said. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Maybe not, Wright said, but some stories are worth telling. What you did on Flight 847 today proves that you're still the same person who was willing to risk everything to save lives. Maybe it's time people knew that. As they ended their conversation, Sarah realized that her decision about the 60 Minutes interview had been made for her. The truth about Kandahar was going to come out whether she controlled it or not. At least by telling her own story, she could ensure that the 4 soldiers whose lives she had saved would be remembered as heroes rather than footnotes in someone else's political scandal. The next morning, Sarah met with Tom Williams from 60 Minutes at a discreet location away from the media circus surrounding her home. Williams had done his homework, and he understood the complexities of her situation better than most journalists would have. "Before we begin," Williams said, "I want you to know that we've independently verified the basic facts of the Kandahar incident. We know about Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's role, and we know about the cover-up. What we don't know is your side of the story." Sarah looked at the camera setup and the production crew preparing for the interview. After 12 years of anonymity, she was about to step back into public view in the most dramatic way possible. "Mr. Williams," she said, "what I'm about to tell you will end the career of a very powerful man and probably make me some dangerous enemies. Are you prepared for that level of controversy?" Williams smiled grimly. "Major Mitchell, investigative. Journalism is about uncovering truth, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. If what you're saying is accurate, then the public has a right to know." As the cameras began rolling, Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath and began to tell the story she had kept hidden for over a decade. She spoke about the impossible choice she had faced in Afghanistan, about the system that had punished her for doing the right thing, and about the 12 years she had spent trying to forget that she had ever been a soldier. But most importantly, she spoke about the 4 lives that had been saved, because someone was willing to put human decency above military protocol. As she told her story, Sarah realized that her years of hiding hadn't been about shame. They had been about grief for a career she had loved and a system she had believed in until it betrayed her. The interview would air 3 weeks later, but long before then, Sarah's life had already changed irrevocably. The quiet woman who had once tended gardens and designed brochures was gone forever, replaced by someone who had no choice but to stand in the light and defend the choices she had made both in the skies over Afghanistan and in the cockpit of Flight 847. The transformation was complete, and there was no going back. 3 weeks after the 60 Minutes interview aired, Sarah Mitchell's world had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The quiet duplex in Scottsdale had been sold, her freelance graphic design business dissolved, and the woman who had spent 12 years cultivating anonymity found herself at the center of a national conversation about military accountability and heroism. The interview had been devastating for General Marcus Brennan. Within hours of the broadcast, the Pentagon had announced a formal investigation into his conduct during the Kandahar incident. 3 days later, he had submitted his resignation, ending a career that had once seemed destined for the highest levels of military leadership. The 4 soldiers whose lives Sarah had saved in Afghanistan had come forward to corroborate her account, their testimonies providing irrefutable evidence of the cover-up she had exposed. But the most unexpected consequence of Sarah's decision to go public came in the form of a phone call from Jennifer Hayes, the first officer whose life she had helped save on Flight 847. "Sarah," Jennifer said, "I have something to ask you, and I hope you won't think I'm crazy for suggesting it." They were sitting in a coffee shop in Denver, where Sarah had come to testify at the FAA as formal investigation into the emergency landing. The report had concluded that her intervention had prevented what would likely have been a fatal crash, and the aviation community was still buzzing about the unconventional techniques she had taught Jennifer during those critical minutes in the cockpit. "After everything that's happened," Jennifer continued, "I can't stop thinking about what you said up there, about how the aircraft doesn't know the difference between a combat zone and a civilian airport. It only knows physics." Sarah sipped her coffee, waiting for Jennifer to get to her point. "I've been flying commercial aircraft for 8 years," Jennifer said. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about aviation. But what you taught me in 10 minutes changed how I understand flying itself. There are techniques, approaches, ways of thinking about aircraft control that aren't taught in any civilian training program. Military aviation is different, Sarah acknowledged. We're trained for situations that civilian pilots hopefully never encounter. That's exactly my point, Jennifer said, leaning forward with obvious excitement. What if there was a way to bridge that gap? What if civilian pilots could learn from military techniques without having to go through combat to acquire them? Sarah raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you start a training company. Advanced aviation techniques for civilian pilots, taught by someone who's been there and done that under the worst possible conditions. You could teach commercial pilots how to handle situations that aren't covered in standard training programs. The idea was so unexpected that Sarah didn't know how to respond. For 12 years, she had tried to distance herself from aviation entirely. The thought of diving back into that world, of building a career around the skills she had spent so long trying to forget, was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Jennifer, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure I'm ready to think about it, Jennifer interrupted. Right now, you're being celebrated as a hero, but heroes have short attention spans in the media. In 6 months, people will have moved on to the next story. But if you channeled all this attention into something constructive, you could create a legacy that goes far beyond one emergency landing. That evening, Sarah found herself walking through the streets of Denver, thinking about Jennifer's proposal. The idea of returning to aviation had seemed impossible just a month ago, but everything in her life had changed since she stepped into the cockpit of Flight 847. Maybe it was time to stop running from her past and start building something new. From the pieces of who she used to be, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Major Mitchell, this is Captain Rodriguez, 160th SOAR, saw your interview. Our unit is interested in bringing you in as a consultant for advanced flight training. Would you be willing to discuss? Sarah stared at the message, recognizing the designation for the Army's elite Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They weren't offering her a return to active duty. They were asking her to help train the next generation of military pilots based on her unique combination of combat experience and demonstrated ability to teach under pressure. Over the next week, similar offers arrived from unexpected sources. The FAA wanted to consult with her on emergency procedures training. A major airline was interested in having her develop advanced weather flying techniques for their pilot training program. Boeing reached out about participating in a study on human factors in crisis situations, and each offer represented a different path back into the world she had left behind. But they all shared a common theme. People wanted to learn from what she had accomplished, both in combat and in the civilian emergency that had thrust her back into public view. The decision came to her while she was visiting Captain Sullivan in the hospital. He had survived his heart attack and was recovering well, though his flying career was over. As she sat beside his bed, listening to him describe his 30 years of commercial aviation, Sarah realized something that had been eluding her for weeks. "Captain," she said, "do you regret your career in aviation?" Sullivan looked puzzled by the question. "Regret it? Hell no. Flying has been the greatest privilege of my life. Even with what happened on Flight 847, even knowing I'll never sit in a cockpit again, I wouldn't trade those years for anything. What if you had to choose between flying and something that felt more safe, more predictable?" "Sarah," Sullivan said, using her first name for the first time, "safe and predictable is what you've been doing for the past 12 years. How has that worked out for you?" His question hit her like a physical blow. She had spent over a decade trying to build a life around safety and predictability, and it had taken a crisis to reveal how empty that existence had become. The woman who had once thrived on the challenge of flying through hostile territory had been slowly suffocating in a world where her greatest concern was meeting design deadlines. That night, Sarah made 3 phone calls. The first was to Jennifer Hayes, accepting her proposal to explore starting a training company. The second was to Captain Rodriguez, agreeing to meet about the consulting opportunity with Special Operations. The third was to Tom Williams at 60 Minutes, asking if he would be interested in following up on her story as she transitioned back into aviation. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a simulator at the Mitchell Advanced Aviation Training Center in Phoenix, watching a group of commercial pilots practice the same techniques she had taught Jennifer Hayes during the emergency landing. The company she had founded with Jennifer as her business partner was already booked solid for the next year, with waiting lists that stretched even longer. The quiet woman who had once hidden behind gardening books and anonymous design work was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned that running from your past only works until the moment when your past becomes exactly what the world needs. Captain Marcus Sullivan, who had become a close friend during his recovery, served as the company's safety advisor. Dr. Patricia Reeves had left her cardiology practice to become their chief medical officer, specializing in aviation medicine and crisis response. Even Rachel Torres, the flight attendant who had first allowed Sarah into the cockpit, had joined the team as their customer relations manager. As Sarah watched her latest group of students master techniques that might one day save hundreds of lives, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A routine flight, a medical emergency, and a decision to help had destroyed the quiet life she thought she wanted and replaced it with the purposeful existence she had actually needed. The woman in seat 14C had whispered, "I've flown Apache and changed everything." But in the end, it wasn't about the helicopter she had flown or the enemies she had faced in combat. It was about the simple truth that some skills are too important to hide, some knowledge too valuable to waste, and some people too useful to remain anonymous. Sarah Mitchell had stopped running from her past and started building her future. One student at a time, one emergency averted, one life potentially saved. The quiet woman was gone, but the pilot, the real pilot, had finally come home. The success of the training center exceeded even Jennifer's optimistic projections. Within 18 months, they had expanded to 3 locations, with facilities in Phoenix, Denver, and Atlanta. Major airlines were sending their senior pilots for advanced weather training, and the military was contracting with them to develop new emergency procedures based on Sarah's unique methodology that blended combat aviation with civilian operations. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Sarah's new career came from an unexpected source. The 4 soldiers whose lives she had saved in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Sergeant First Class Lisa Kim, Specialist David Walsh, and Private First Class Amanda Reeves had all remained in contact after the 60 Minutes interview brought them back into her life. Each had followed different paths after their military service, but they shared a bond forged in the moments when Sarah had defied orders to bring them home. Torres had become a commercial pilot himself after leaving the Army, inspired by Sarah's courage to pursue aviation despite the risks. When he learned about the training center, he applied to become an instructor, bringing his own perspective as someone who had experienced both military and civilian aviation cultures. "Major," he said during his interview, still using her former rank out of habit, "you saved my life twice. Once in Afghanistan, and once by showing me that doing the right thing is worth any career consequences." Kim had taken a different path, becoming a trauma counselor who specialized in helping veterans transition to civilian careers. She volunteered at the training center, working with former military pilots who struggled with the same identity issues that had plagued Sarah for 12 years. "A lot of ex-military aviators feel lost in the civilian world," Kim explained to Sarah during one of their sessions. "They've been trained for life or death situations, and then they're expected to be satisfied with routine operations. What you've created here gives them a way to use their skills meaningfully without compromising their principles. The training center had become more than a business. It was a community of aviators who understood that the most important skills couldn't be learned from textbooks or standard simulators. They required the kind of judgment that came from facing impossible choices and the wisdom that emerged from learning to live with the consequences. Sarah's personal transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The woman who had once spent her evenings reading gardening books in solitude now found herself at the center of a growing network of professionals who looked to her for leadership and guidance. She had learned to embrace public speaking, appearing at aviation conferences and safety seminars, where she shared the lessons learned from both her military service and the Flight 847 emergency. During one particularly memorable presentation at the International Association of Flight Safety, Sarah was approached by a young commercial pilot who reminded her of herself at the beginning of her career. "Ms. Mitchell," the pilot said, "I'm facing a situation where my company is pressuring me to cut corners on safety procedures to meet scheduling demands. After hearing your story about Afghanistan, I wanted to ask, how do you know when it's worth risking your career to do what you believe is right?" Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing in her the same combination of idealism and uncertainty that she remembered from her own early days as a military aviator. "The question isn't whether it's worth risking your career," she replied. "The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't take that risk. In my experience, the consequences of doing the right thing are always easier to bear than the consequences of staying silent." The pilot nodded, understanding passing between them. It was the kind of moment that had become common in Sarah's new life opportunities to share hard-won wisdom with the next generation of aviators who would face their own impossible choices. The most profound change in Sarah's life came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had worked alongside her during Captain Sullivan's medical emergency, had become not just a business partner, but a close friend. Their shared experience of crisis had created a bond that transcended their professional relationship. "Sarah," Dr. Reeves said during one of their regular dinner meetings, "I've been thinking about something you said during those first interviews after Flight 847. You mentioned that you had spent 12 years trying to forget you were ever a soldier." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "I thought civilian life would be simpler, more peaceful." "But what you've built here isn't simple or peaceful," Dr. Reeves observed. "It's challenging, demanding, and requires the same kind of courage you showed in the military. The difference is that now you're choosing these challenges instead of having them imposed on you." Sarah considered this observation, realizing its truth. The training center required her to make difficult decisions, manage complex personalities, and constantly push the boundaries of conventional aviation training. But unlike her military service, where she had been constrained by bureaucracy and politics, her current work allowed her to pursue excellence without compromise. The vindication of her choices came in an unexpected form 2 years after the Flight 847 incident. The National Transportation Safety Board released a comprehensive study on passenger intervention in aviation emergencies, using Sarah's actions as a case study for effective crisis management. The report concluded that her unconventional approach had not only prevented a catastrophic accident, but had also provided valuable insights into human factors during emergency situations. More significantly, the study recommended changes to commercial pilot training that incorporated many of the techniques Sarah had developed at her training center. The aviation industry, which had initially been skeptical of her military-derived methods, was now officially endorsing approaches that challenged decades of conventional wisdom. Captain Jennifer Hayes, who had become Sarah's closest collaborator and friend, reflected on their journey during the second anniversary of Flight 847. "You know," she said, "when I was struggling with that approach in the storm, I thought the worst thing that could happen would be crashing the plane. But looking back, I think the worst thing would have been landing safely without learning what you taught me up there." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I mean that crisis revealed capabilities I didn't know I had, and more importantly, it connected me with someone whose knowledge has transformed not just my flying, but my entire understanding of what it means to be a pilot. Without that emergency, I would have spent my career following procedures instead of truly understanding the principles behind them." As Sarah looked around the bustling training center, watching instructors work with students in simulators that replicated the most challenging conditions imaginable, she understood that Jennifer was right. The emergency that had ended her anonymity had also restored her sense of purpose. She had spent 12 years hiding from her identity as a soldier and pilot, only to discover that those very qualities were exactly what the aviation world needed. The woman who had once whispered, "I've flown Apache," in a moment of crisis had become someone who could say it proudly, knowing that every skill she had learned in combat was now being used to prevent tragedies and save lives in the civilian world. The quiet passenger in seat 14C was gone forever, but in her place was someone far more valuable, a teacher, leader, and guardian whose influence would be felt in cockpits around the world for generations to come. Sarah Mitchell had finally found her way home, not to the past she had fled, but to a future she had never imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.